Colleagues from Arizona and South Carolina, Senators McCain and Graham, to speak about the war in Afghanistan. Mr. President, for the first time since 9/11, a national debate is underway about the future of our fight in Afghanistan. This is appropriate. Whenever our nation sends our brave men and women in uniform into harm's way, it is both natural and necessary that we should have a vigorous national conversation about why we are doing so, whether it is necessary for our national security, and what the right strategy is to achieve our objectives. Truth is, we have not had such a debate since the decision that we made unanimously to go into Afghanistan after 9/11 to overthrow the Taliban, which had given safe haven to al-Qaeda, which planned and trained for the attacks on us from Afghanistan. The most direct answer to the question of why we are fighting in Afghanistan and why we must succeed there is exactly that. Afghanistan is where the attacks of 9/11 originated, where al-Qaeda made its sanctuary under the Taliban, and where the same Taliban is on the offensive today in Afghanistan and has seized the initiative with the clear aim of gaining control of all of Afghanistan, or major parts of it, and once again providing sanctuary for al-Qaeda. It remains self-evidently a clear, vital national interest of the United States to prevent this from happening. It is also because, although Afghanistan may seem geographically remote, we found out on 9/11/01, in this modern technological world, when great spaces are passed over quickly, that it is not remote when it comes to the safety and security of the American people. Afghanistan is in the heart of a region in which we have critical national interests. The fact is, Afghanistan and Pakistan are today at the epicenter of global Islamist extremism and terrorism with which we are at war. This is the test of our age insofar as our security is concerned. I'd be glad to.
Could I ask my friend, is it true yesterday when we had the hearing with Admiral Mullen for renomination as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who I think we would all agree has done an outstanding job of serving our country, wasn't it pretty clear that Admiral Mullen felt a sense of urgency for us to act in Afghanistan because al-Qaeda and the Taliban especially the Taliban, are making inroads, and we, in his words, are not winning, so we are at least not seeing the progress that we want, that we are losing, basically, in Afghanistan, and said things like to you and Senator Graham that the important thing is the time is not on our side, and we needed to get troops over there as quickly as possible, in keeping with the strategy that was devised in March of this year and agreed to by the President. That was my understanding. Senator Graham said, okay, now as to civilians, I just got back from a visit. I appreciate all of our civilians who are over there from different agencies. They're very brave, but quite honestly, they can't go anywhere. And Admiral Mullen said, right. Graham said you could send 10,000 lawyers from the State Department to deal with the rural law programs, but they're sitting on the base because if they leave the base, they're going to get shot. Admiral Mullen, right. And then Graham said the only way they get off the base is they have a military convoy. Is that right? Mullen said, right. And Admiral Mullen then went on to say, after Senator Graham said, so I just want our colleagues to know that the security environment in Afghanistan, from my point of view, will prevent any civilian success until we change the security environment. How long would it take to train enough Afghan troops to change the momentum, in your view, if you did it with Afghan forces? And he said 2 or 3 years. And then Senator Graham said, what will happen in that 2 or 3 year period in terms of the security environment while we're training. And Mullen said, if it's just training, Graham said, yes. Mullen said, I think the security environment will continue to deteriorate. Doesn't that, I asked my friend, lend urgency, which is certainly not apparent in the President's statement today, after meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister, basically that he's going to go through a long process of evaluation and another strategy, claiming that he didn't have one before. That's what's disturbing, is the total lack of urgency in the President's statement today.
Mr. President, I say to my friend from Arizona, I was surprised and puzzled by that statement of the President today, particularly because the President, I think, has been very strong about Afghanistan. He has called Afghanistan a war of necessity for the reason that I said, because we can't allow al-Qaeda and the Taliban to come back into control of Afghanistan. Forgive the analogy, but any more than after World War II, if the Nazis had somehow reassembled and attempted to retake control of part or all of Germany, we would have sat back. We simply can't let that happen. Also, we know that if Afghanistan falls, if we accept defeat or for some reason retreat from Afghanistan, it will profoundly destabilize neighboring nuclear Pakistan and encourage the Islamist extremists throughout that region and the world. So my friend from Arizona is right, that there is a sense of urgency that he and our colleague and friend from South Carolina, Senator Graham, is on the floor, saw when we visited with General McChrystal and Admiral Eikenberry and the Afghan national security leadership a month ago. But Admiral Mullen just yesterday said that we have lost the initiative in Afghanistan. It's why President Obama deployed the additional 21,000 troops in March and announced this new strategy.
Gentleman, yield for one more question here real quick.
I'd be glad.
Isn't it true, and this is where the contradiction is, that really what's so paradoxical, it's hard for me to comprehend. Admiral Mullen, in a question, I said, Admiral Mullen, didn't you say, quote, time is not on our side? Admiral Mullen, no, sir. I have a sense of urgency about this. I worry a great deal that the clock is moving very rapidly. And there are lots of clocks, as you know, but the sense of urgency, and I, believe me, share that with General McChrystal, who, while he is very focused on a change which includes a focus on the Afghan people, he is alarmed by the insurgency. He is in a position where he needs to retake the initiative from the insurgents who have grabbed it over the last 3 years. And then you contrast that with the President's statement today, where he said, I'm absolutely clear. You have to get the strategy right and then make the determinations about resources. You don't make determinations about resources. Certainly you don't make determinations about sending young men and women into battle without having absolute clarity about what the strategy is going to be. He said, my determination is to get this right, and that means broad consultation, not only inside the U.S. government, but also with our ISAF partners and our NATO allies. And I'm going to take a very deliberate process in making these decisions. I don't know what to make of that.
Well, I think the statement by our top uniformed military officer, Admiral Mike Mullen, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, reflects what General McChrystal and everybody on the ground in Afghanistan has said. This is an urgent matter. The President recognized that when he sent the 21,000 additional troops. And, you know, most everybody in this chamber and in the House will accept the fact that it would have a devastating effect on America's national security and the security of the world if we lost Afghanistan. But then comes the question, and incidentally, President Obama himself said this in a statement he made a while ago. He said, we cannot muddle through in Afghanistan. It requires a decisive commitment to achieve victory. We learned that in Iraq. Counterinsurgencies such as we're involved in Afghanistan is manpower intensive. And so that's the question the administration and we here in Congress have. If you agree that it's in the vital national security interest of the United States to succeed in Afghanistan, then you got to decide how we can best do that. And to me, the answer is clear. We need more troops there, American troops, while the Afghans are being trained to take over themselves. And they can't just be trainers, as Admiral Mullen made clear yesterday. They need to be combat troops. And they need to be combat troops because without the security that the American combat troops will singularly and uniquely provide in the short term, there can't even be training of the Afghans. There certainly can't be governance as we know it, and there can't be a prospect for economic development. So we need to make this decision soon. Weather has an effect.
Go for a question.
I would, to my friend from South Carolina. Glad to.
As I understand the situation in the last couple of months, casualties among American forces are at an all-time high since the invasion. Do you agree with that, Senator?
That, unfortunately, is the truth.
And it's also my understanding that IED attacks by the enemy have gone up about 1,000%. In reaction to that, Secretary Gates has sent 3,000 people over to deal with the IED problem. And from my understanding of the testimony yesterday, Admiral Mullen said that the force structure we have in place between the combination of coalition forces and Afghan forces are not enough to reverse the trends and to regain lost momentum. I thought it was pretty clear that he was telling us something has to change beyond training the Afghan army. And would you agree, Senator, that the longer we leave people in that environment where the momentum is on the enemy's side, we're doing a great disservice to the 68,000 people who are there. And if you're going to send troops, send them while it matters, send them in enough numbers to save lives and get the job over sooner rather than later. That is what I think all three of us are saying. Mr. President, we appreciate your commitment in Afghanistan. Sending troops to get the election conducted was a wise move. Understanding that Afghanistan is a central battle and the overall war on terror now is a deep understanding on the President's part. Only thing we're saying, the three of us, and I think others, is that our military commanders have told us we've lost momentum, and the only way to get it back in the short term is more combat power. And every day that we wait makes it much harder for those who are in theater, and they're dying at levels and being injured at levels we've not known before. And that's what drives our thinking. Would you agree with that?
I totally agree, with my friend from South Carolina. This, in fact, is the lesson that we should have learned, and I think did learn, in Iraq. When did the number of American casualties in Iraq begin to go down? It was when we sent more American troops there, because the addition of American troops stabilized, and a new strategy, not just the numbers, but a strategy quite similar to the new strategy we have in Afghanistan. Protect the civilian population, give them the confidence that we're not leaving. And when you do that, something really significant happens. It happened in Iraq, and it'll happen in Afghanistan. When we commit more troops, the people in the country decide we're not going to cut and run. The Afghan people despise the Taliban. The progress that the Taliban is making in controlling more land in Afghanistan is totally the result of violence and intimidation. The Afghan people, however, are watching us and wondering, are we going to begin to pull back? Should they hedge their bets? Should they be careful not to join the fight against the Taliban? If we begin to sound an uncertain trumpet, you remember that phrase from scriptures, if the sound of the trumpet is uncertain, who will follow into battle? And I'll tell you one group that won't follow into battle if America begins to sound an uncertain trumpet in Afghanistan. It's the people of Afghanistan. We have a desire now that most everybody here shares. Let's break some of the Taliban away, the ones that are not zealots, the ones that are, that in a sense are foot soldiers who are not believers. They're the comparable group to the sons of Iraq in Anbar province. But when did the sons of Iraq decide that they were going to turn against al-Qaeda when we convinced them that we were going to stay in Anbar and protect them. In fact, how did we convince them? By sending more troops. And it was after that that the Iraqi security forces grew in capability, that the American casualties went down. And I would say to my friend, he's touched a very important point here, that the only way we will reduce American casualties, which are now going up, and to create an environment in which more Afghans will join the war against the Taliban and al-Qaeda, is for us to give them the confidence we're not going to leave. And the best way to do that and provide the security to do that is by sending more troops. And incidentally, final word, and then I'll yield to my friend from South Carolina. There are those, including our dear friend and respected chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Senator Levin, who is focused on sending more Americans only for training purposes, not combat troops. But here's something else we learned in Iraq. The fact is that you need more than trainers to train the indigenous forces. One of the great tactical breakthroughs in Iraq that General McChrystal wants to put into effect, in fact, has begun to in Afghanistan. There's no better way to train the Afghan forces than to partner them with American and coalition forces in Afghanistan. It's not just sending somebody to a school run by Americans to train them. It's having the Afghan units out there in the field, side by side, working with, fighting with, living with American soldiers. That is the best source of training. So I couldn't agree with my friends from South Carolina and Arizona more. The situation in Afghanistan is a vital national interest. Everybody agrees with that. I think you can't listen to Admiral Mike Mullen yesterday and decide that the initiative is ours now. It's not. It's slipping away from us. And the best way to regain the initiative is to send as many troops as we can. Listening to General McChrystal, a lot of them have to be combat troops, and to do so as quickly as possible. I say the weather a moment ago. When the winters are harsh in Afghanistan, and it's not to say that all conflict stops, but there is a fighting season in Afghanistan. And this year, we didn't really have adequate forces there until that new wave that President Obama deployed got there. They didn't get there till June. We were together in Helmand Province with General Larry Nicholson, extraordinary American Marine general, a patriot, a great soldier, a great fighter, a great leader. Those Marines are turning back the tide against the Taliban there because they've got the numbers. And that's exactly what we have to do throughout the country. I thank my friend, and I'm glad to yield the floor to him at this time.
Madam President, I'd like to be recognized for 5 minutes. Could you let me know when 5 minutes is up? I'd like to pick up where my colleague, Senator Lieberman, left off. The question they asked is, how have the Taliban regained momentum? How in the world could a bunch of fighters who don't have one tank, not one airplane, no Navy, no heavy weapons to speak of, how could they have regained momentum and began to reoccupy parts of Afghanistan? The only answer that I can come up with is that a vacuum has been created, and that vacuum has two components to it: the lack of governance and not enough troops to prevent the Taliban from coming back in some areas of Afghanistan. I would submit this: if we wait to train the Afghan army is the only way to stabilize Afghanistan, we're going to waste 2 or 3 years, and it's going to get so bad we can't stand the casualties, and the American people will not tolerate a 2 or 3 year period of where we're just training the Afghan forces, sending them from the training cycle into combat. They're going to fold just like they did in Iraq. You cannot train an army and have them fight at the same time. You need a little bit of breathing space. So this idea that we're going to train the Afghan army and that's the way we will regain momentum against the Taliban, quite frankly, won't work. And I think Admiral Mullen understood that. What will work is to send more combat power to clear the areas that the Taliban have reoccupied, which can be done, and the Marines are telling us in no uncertain terms, with the right mix of troops, they're delivering punishing blows to the Taliban. But you could send 1 million troops to Afghanistan and still not deal with the fundamental problem that they face and the world faces: the legitimacy of the Afghan government in the eyes of the Afghan people. That's why the Taliban have come back, because the Afghan government has failed. They failed in almost every respect to give the Afghan people the governance and the hope they need to stand up to the Taliban. So this is one senator who believes that the way to regain lost momentum is to add more combat power. And yes, train the Afghan army and police force with a new strategy, which we now have in place. It's labor intensive, it's going to take a lot of time. And you got to understand that if we get the Afghan army up to 400,000, the whole budget of Afghanistan is $800 million a year. It'll take $5 billion a year to maintain that army, and we're going to wind up paying it. I hope the American taxpayer understands that. But really, it's cheaper for us to do that than it is for us to be the 400,000 person army. So when it comes to cost, it is better to train them and help them with their training and funding than it is to stay over there in large numbers forever. But we're going to have to plus up to regain lost momentum. Then we're going to have to focus on the real cause of the deterioration: governance. The Karzai government has failed in many ways. Corruption is rampant. If in the next 6 months some major figures in Afghanistan are not prosecuted for ripping off the Afghan people, then nothing will ever change over there. I've been a military lawyer serving as a reservist in Afghanistan, and I can tell you that everyone who's looked at the rule of law programs will tell you that corruption, narcotics corruption, is rampant in that country, and they need a legal system in Afghanistan that can stand up to the corruption. That means you got to protect the judges from being assassinated, and you got to build capacity. There are less than 500 lawyers in all of Afghanistan. There's 16,000 people in jail. Most of them went to jail without ever seeing a lawyer. We've got our work cut out for us. We need benchmarks and measurements so that I can go back to South Carolina and every senator can go back to their constituents and saying, we're not throwing good money after bad, that we're going to push the Afghan government to prosecute corruption, to provide security for judges, to find a way to empower the economy beyond the drug trade. Start making hard decisions about how tribal justice systems can be incorporated into the formal justice system. There are so many decisions that politicians in Afghanistan have failed to make that have allowed the Taliban to come back, and we need to put them on notice that with new resources and new troops, a new dynamic will be in place, and you will be making the decisions necessary to provide governance to your people. And if you fail to do that, then you will not have our support. Because at the end of the day, they have to want it more than we do. Now, Senator Lieberman is right about this. The good news, amidst all this bad news, is the Taliban are very much reviled and hated within the country. But just put yourself in one of these villages out in the middle of Afghanistan. One more minute, please. What would you do knowing that by night the Taliban comes in and rains terror? We've got to replace that dynamic and give the people assurance that we're going to not only provide them security, but the Afghan government is going to provide them schooling and education, health care, and some hope. Finally, I can't tell you that we will succeed with more troops. I can tell you we will fail if we don't send more troops. It's so much harder than Afghanistan in many ways than it is in Iraq. But we're not the Russians. We're not the British. This is not Vietnam. This is not Iraq. This is Afghanistan, where 9/11 was planned and executed. We can get this right.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Absolutely. I will yield the floor to the senator and take one question.
I just asked a question. I see we have one of our colleagues
yes, she wants to.
waiting to speak. I don't know. I wonder what the gentleman thinks about. We held a hearing yesterday with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is highly regarded.
Yeah.
And he conveys to every questioner, no matter which member it is, a sense of urgency because of his belief and that of our military commanders on the ground that we are not winning.
Right.
In fact, in the words of Admiral Mullen, time is not on our side. And yet today, the President of the United States comes out after a meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister and basically says that he is after his spokesperson said it's going to take weeks and weeks to make a decision. And he comes out and basically says that there's not a sense of urgency, that the strategy that was developed in March was not the operative strategy, even though Admiral Mullen said that the March strategy was the operative strategy, and all we need to do was fill in the resources and the strategy. My question to my friend from South Carolina is, how do you account for this apparent contradiction or difference in view about the sense of urgency that exists in the conflict in Afghanistan?
Well, the one thing I can tell you is that Admiral Mullen is going to be reappointed, probably with every person in this body voting for him because he's gained our trust. And it speaks well of the president that he would renominate him. So he's obviously gained the president's trust. I'm not a military commander, but you don't have to be much of a military expert to understand his testimony. His testimony was pretty clear. We've lost momentum. The Taliban are reemerging stronger than ever, and the capability of the coalition forces and the Afghan army and security forces combined cannot reverse the momentum. Something new has to happen. And when we put on the table training the Afghan army without additional combat power, how long would it take before they could have enough numbers to change things, 2 or 3 years? What would happen during that training period? It would deteriorate further. What did he tell us? The pathway forward is that we've got a new strategy. It needs to be properly resourced. And I think what he was telling us more than anything else, Senator McCain, is that time is not on our side. Casualties in July and August are an all-time high. You've got 68,000 people wearing our uniform in Afghanistan who are getting killed in larger numbers than ever, and the dynamic on the ground will not change the momentum. To do nothing puts them in an environment where they're going to continue to get killed in higher numbers. And what Admiral Mullen is telling us, and I hope the President will listen, is that time is not on our side, but more importantly, is not on their side. And this decision about troops, to me, is pretty easy. We need more, but troops alone won't fix Afghanistan. But without more troops in a hurry, and with a sense of urgency, we're going to let the Taliban get stronger. The Afghan people are going to get weaker in their resolve, and more Americans are going to die than if you had more troops. That's what I got out of the hearing.
Well,
I hope the President's listening.
Again, I also would ask my colleague, we've forgotten the lessons of history. We were there and we assisted the Afghans in driving out the Russians, and our assistance was critical. The Russians left, and we left. And when we left, it left a vacuum that ended up in fighting between warlords, and the Taliban filled the vacuum. The Taliban had an arrangement with al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11, which we just commemorated, were able to be trained there in Afghanistan. I hope our memories are not so short that we are willing to risk a repetition of that kind of threat, which the President during the campaign seemed to recognize very accurately. Called it the good war, said the war we had to win, do what's necessary to win. And now I really do worry, and I wonder if my colleague does, that every day we delay doing what we all know is necessary puts the lives of young Americans who are already there at risk and makes it a longer period of time before we can prevail.
The last thought about that, I think our memories, the event that we need to remember is even later than 9/11. It's actually in Iraq. I remember very well this whole debate, and I would urge this administration not to do what the last administration did. That's exactly what's going on in Afghanistan right now. It's as if we've learned nothing. It is clear, just as it was in Iraq, that we did not have enough combat power to secure the country, not enough mentoring programs to adequately train the Iraqi army, and only when we changed the strategy of adding more troops and gave the Iraqi people and army some breathing space, the politicians, from the violence, did things change. It's exactly the same thing here. But right now, we've got a dynamic on the ground that is not much different than Iraq the first 3 years after the fall of Saddam Hussein. And it's clear that Admiral Mullen recognizes that. The new strategy in March is a counterinsurgency strategy. And Senator McCain, the one thing I remember is numbers matter. You need enough troops per population center to affect change. And we don't have the ratios to enact an effective counterinsurgency strategy unless you add more troops, and that means more than just trainers. So my frustration is that, as you said yesterday, we've seen this movie before. We're putting 68,000 troops in harm's way, and unless we properly resource them, give them more assistance, more people to help them fight, they're not going to change the battle momentum, and they're going to get killed in the process. There's not enough people to affect a counterinsurgency strategy, just like there wasn't enough in Iraq. So have we learned nothing? So let's act. Mr. President, we will support you to the nth degree to get the combat power and the trainers and the civilians into Afghanistan to turn this place around. But the sooner you act, the quicker we can do it, and the sooner we can come home, and the less lives we'll lose in the long run. So that's our message. We respect you. You're the commander-in-chief. You won the election, but you got an opportunity here, and it's clear to me that we're losing momentum, and this is not a time to deliberate. This is a time to act.
Senator has used 10 minutes.